A taxi driver takes an 88-year-old man to the nursing home. But as he leaves, the elderly man turns around and says, "It was a quiet, sunlit morning, with a gentle breeze stirring the leaves and sending ripples of light across the street." In his modest taxi, Paolo glanced in the rearview mirror, observing his passenger, an elderly man seated in the back. Mr. Manuel, aged 88, gazed out the window, his worn eyes lost in contemplation. The old man's hand rested on a leather-bound notebook, a relic Paolo noticed the moment he'd helped him into the car. There was something reverent about how he handled it, as if it contained a lifetime of memories, carefully preserved in ink. Paolo couldn't help but feel a tug at his curiosity. Although he was usually quiet with his clients, something about Mr. Manuel called to him, urging him to break the silence. After a few minutes of driving, Paolo cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Paolo started, a casual attempt at small talk. Mr. Manuel shifted his gaze, blinking as if awoken from a distant memory. He nodded, a soft smile tracing his lips. Yes, it is," he murmured, his voice low and thoughtful. "Mornings like this used to remind me of my wife Maria. She adored the sun." Paolo felt a spark of connection with the old man. "I bet you've got a lot of memories like that," he said, glancing again in the mirror. "Were you two married a long time?" Mr. Manuel nodded, his gaze once more turning toward the window. 52 years, he replied, his voice filled with both pride and a tinge of sorrow. "She left us 10 years ago, but I still feel her presence every day. Maria was everything." The conversation fell silent for a moment, as Paolo let the weight of Mr. Manuel's words sink in. He imagined the life this man had lived, the memories that had filled those years with love, joy, and perhaps sorrow. "What kind of life did you have together?" Paolo asked softly. Mr. Manuel's eyes softened, and his grip on the leather notebook tightened. "We had dreams, young man. Dreams as big as the world. We wanted to travel, to build a home that felt like us. And we did. At least, as much as life allowed. We had a small house, one we built with our own hands. Every brick, every nail, we put it all together ourselves." Paolo could sense that the story went deeper, perhaps beyond Mr. Manuel's lifetime. "And where's that house now? Do you still live there?" Mr. Manuel shook his head slowly, his expression darkening slightly. "No, it's been a while since I was there. Life moves us along, even when our hearts stay anchored." He paused, looking out at the passing trees. "Today, well, I'm headed somewhere different." Paolo's brows knitted with confusion as he pieced together what this morning's drive was leading to. A part of him dreaded asking the question, but he had to know. "So, are you moving? Is this a new beginning for you?" A slow, sad smile spread across Mr. Manuel's face as he glanced at Paolo. "Some might call it that. But for me, it feels like an end." The words lingered, resonating between them as they traveled down the road. Paolo tightened his grip on the steering wheel, feeling a swell of emotions he couldn't fully comprehend. It seemed unfathomable to him, leaving behind all that one had built, all the love and memories of a lifetime. He looked back at Mr. Manuel, his voice tentative yet sincere. "But is it really the end, Mr. Manuel? Seems to me you've got a lot of stories left to tell." For the first time that morning, Mr. Manuel's face lit up with a spark. "Stories, yes," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I've got plenty of those. Most are old tales now, but they're as clear to me as the day they happened." He held up the leather notebook, patting it gently. "And they're all here, every one." Paolo's curiosity surged. Would you be willing to share one?" he asked, trying not to sound too eager. "I'd love to hear it, if you don't mind." A contemplative look crossed Mr. Manuel's face. "Well, I suppose I could tell you a few." He chuckled softly, glancing down at the notebook as though the memories inside might come to life at any moment. "Where to begin, though? Perhaps with the story of how I met Maria." As Mr. Manuel spoke, the air in the taxi grew warm, and Paolo found himself fully drawn into the world of Mr. Manuel's past. Mr. Manuel's voice grew rich, his words filled with the kind of wonder that only memories preserved in the heart could hold. He spoke of a rainy afternoon many years ago, of a crowded train station, and a girl holding a worn red umbrella. He told Paolo of their first conversation, awkward and clumsy, and of how they laughed at the small details that tied their lives together from the start. And she, Mr. Manuel continued, his voice softening as he smiled to himself, she made the rain feel like sunshine. Paolo glanced over at the older man, realizing that this was more than just a story. It was a gift, a glimpse into a life shaped by love, resilience, and memories that lingered, even as new chapters began. For a while, they drove in silence as Mr. Manuel's story settled in Paolo's mind. Finally, they arrived at the destination, a modest, cozy-looking facility with a garden blooming in shades of lavender and green. As Paolo parked the taxi and turned off the engine, he took a deep breath, feeling unexpectedly moved. "Mr. Manuel," he said gently, "it was an honor hearing your story. I'm glad I could be here with you this morning." The old man smiled, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "And I'm glad you asked, Paolo. Sometimes, all we need is a kind soul to listen." As they pulled up to the entrance, Paolo's heart felt heavier than he'd anticipated. The nursing home was a quaint, well-kept place, nestled among trees with benches under sprawling oaks and rows of bright flowers, leading to the front entrance. But there was a weight in the air, a quiet resignation that seemed to cling to the place. Paolo glanced back at Mr. Manuel, who was taking it all in, his gaze lingering on the garden, the building, the nurses moving about with calm, practiced steps. "Here we are," Paolo said softly, trying to hide the ache in his voice. It didn't seem right that a man with so many stories, so much life in him, would be moving into a place like this alone. Mr. Manuel's hand brushed over his notebook, his thumb tracing the edges of its worn leather cover. "Thank you, Paolo. It's been a long time since anyone's asked about my life. Today, it's almost like I got to relive it a little." Paolo turned off the engine and got out, quickly moving to open the back door. He offered Mr. Manuel his arm as the elderly man stepped carefully out of the taxi, his body slow but still with a dignified bearing that belied his age. Once out, Mr. Manuel took a deep breath, breathing in the scent of the flowers and the earth around him. It was almost as though he were soaking in the last bit of freedom before stepping into a new, unfamiliar chapter. They walked toward the entrance in silence, Paolo guiding him with a hand on his arm, feeling the frail yet steady grip of the man beside him. As they neared the building, Mr. Manuel slowed down, his gaze drifting around as though searching for something he couldn't quite find. "You know," he murmured, breaking the silence, "this wasn't where I imagined I'd be at this age. I always thought I'd spend my last years in the house Maria and I built together. Every room had a memory, every corner a story." His voice grew faint, and Paolo noticed his shoulders sag ever so slightly. "But life has its own plans, I suppose." Paolo hesitated, glancing at Mr. Manuel, who seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him. "Mr. Manuel," he ventured, "have you visited this place before? I mean, is there someone here you know, or someone to help you settle in?" A rueful smile touched Mr. Manuel's face as he shook his head. "No, Paolo. No family left. Maria and I couldn't have children, and the years, well, they took the rest." He looked up, his face a mixture of pride and sadness. "You know, I always prided myself on being able to take care of myself. I didn't think I'd ever end up in a place like this. It's strange how the years can surprise you like that." Paolo's heart clenched, and he felt the words on the tip of his tongue. Words that might offer comfort or reassurance, though he couldn't be sure. Before he could speak, Mr. Manuel continued, his voice growing softer. "Maria would have known what to do. She always knew how to make the best of every situation." He sighed, almost to himself, then turned to Paolo with a gentle smile. "Thank you for helping me today. You've done more than just drive me here, you know. You've given me a piece of my past, if only for a little while." Paolo felt a surge of respect for the man, and he knew he couldn't just walk away and leave Mr. Manuel to enter the nursing home alone. "Mr. Manuel," he said, his voice firm, "how about I walk you to the entrance? I can help you settle in at least." Mr. Manuel's eyes widened slightly, surprised, but his expression quickly softened with gratitude. "That would be kind of you, Paolo. More kind than I deserve, perhaps." Together, they walked slowly to the building, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet, and the soft whisper of the trees the only sounds around them. Paolo could feel the tension in Mr. Manuel's step, the weight of his apprehension, and he wished there was more he could do to ease it. As they reached the entrance, a nurse greeted them with a polite, practiced smile. "Good morning, Mr. Manuel. We're all ready for you. We've got a nice room prepared and oh." She noticed Paulo and raised an eyebrow. "And you must be family?" Paulo shook his head. "Just a friend." He felt Mr. Manuel's hand tighten on his arm, as if for reassurance. The nurse looked from one to the other and smiled, a hint of warmth in her eyes. "Well, it's lovely that you're here to help him get settled." Mr. Manuel turned to Paulo, his face lit by a soft, grateful smile. "Thank you," he whispered. "It makes it easier, not being alone." He seemed to be trying to memorize Paulo's face, as though wanting to carry the memory with him into this new and uncertain chapter of his life. Paulo met his gaze, feeling a mix of admiration and sadness for this man who had lived so much, yet found himself so alone. "Anytime, Mr. Manuel." "Really?" With a nod, Mr. Manuel finally turned toward the nurse, and she guided him gently inside. Paulo watched as he walked away, his back straight, his steps slow but deliberate. Just as they reached the doorway, Mr. Manuel paused, glancing over his shoulder one last time. "Don't forget, Paulo," he called out, a glint of something hopeful in his eyes. "Take care of your own story. It's a precious thing." Paulo nodded, unable to find words, as Mr. Manuel disappeared inside. For a moment he stood rooted there, feeling a peculiar emptiness, a tugging sensation deep inside. It was as though the morning had opened up something within him, a yearning to know his own story better, to understand what memories and dreams filled his own life. As Paulo climbed back into his taxi and started the engine, he found himself gazing out at the nursing home, feeling as if he were leaving behind a piece of his own heart. And somewhere in the quiet of his mind, Mr. Manuel's words echoed, urging him to see his own life with the same depth and gratitude. With a final look, Paulo drove away, his thoughts churning, already wondering if he would ever see Mr. Manuel again. And as he turned the corner, he realized he hoped, deeply unexpectedly, that he would. As the taxi rolled through familiar streets, Paulo found himself replaying the morning's events, Mr. Manuel's words, and the look in his eyes stirring something deep within him. There was a sense of purpose, almost urgency, lingering in the air, and Paulo couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't done enough. He drove in silence for a while, glancing at the back seat where Mr. Manuel had sat only minutes ago. That quiet resignation on the old man's face, the way he'd clutched that worn leather notebook, as if it were his last anchor. Paulo couldn't forget it. What must it feel like, he wondered, to live through so many memories, only to end up in a place that isn't your own, among strangers? After a few minutes, Paulo pulled over at the side of the road, letting the silence of the empty street settle around him. His hand hovered over his phone, hesitating, until he finally picked it up and dialed the number he'd gotten from the nursing home. St. Catherine's residence. The receptionist answered with a practiced, professional tone. "Hi, this is Paulo. I just dropped off Mr. Manuel," he said, stumbling over his words. He hadn't fully thought through what he wanted to say, only that he couldn't leave things as they were. "Yes, I remember," the receptionist replied. "Is there something I can help you with? Would you mind, could you let him know that I'll come by later?" Paulo asked, feeling a bit foolish. "I'd like to check in on him, if that's okay." There was a pause on the line, and Paulo could almost sense the surprise in the receptionist's silence. When she finally spoke, her tone softened. "Of course. I'll pass the message along. I think he'd appreciate the company." Paulo thanked her and hung up, a strange mix of relief and anticipation settling over him. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish by visiting, but he knew that Mr. Manuel deserved at least one friendly face to rely on. Later that afternoon, Paulo made his way back to the nursing home, carrying a small bag with a thermos of coffee and a couple of sandwiches he'd picked up from the corner cafe. As he entered, the receptionist greeted him with a smile and guided him to a quiet lounge area where Mr. Manuel was seated by a large window, gazing out at the garden. "Mr. Manuel," she said softly, "you have a visitor." The elderly man looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as he recognized Paulo. A warm, grateful smile spread across his face. "Paulo, what a surprise! I didn't think I'd see you again so soon." Paolo smiled and held up the bag. Thought you might appreciate a break from the usual. So I brought us a little something to share. Mr. Manuel's eyes glistened as he looked at the bag. That's very kind of you, Paolo. I can't remember the last time someone did something like this for me. They sat together by the window, with Paolo pouring 2 cups of coffee from the thermos and handing one to Mr. Manuel. The old man took a sip, savoring it with a pleased sigh. Ah, real coffee. That's a luxury I'd nearly forgotten. Paolo laughed, glancing out the window. So, Mr. Manuel, what do you think of this place? I mean, is it what you expected? Mr. Manuel looked down, twirling the cup in his hands as he pondered the question. It's quiet, he said finally. Peaceful, I suppose. But there's something hollow about it. He chuckled softly, almost embarrassed. Forgive me if I sound ungrateful. I'm just not sure this is where I belong. Paolo nodded, understanding more than he could put into words. I think anyone in your shoes would feel the same, Mr. Manuel. I mean, after all the things you've built and lived through, it must feel strange to leave all of that behind. Mr. Manuel nodded, his gaze becoming distant. I spent so many years making that house a home. Every nail, every coat of paint, it was Maria and me. That home held every part of our lives. His voice wavered, and he cleared his throat before continuing. I imagined that's where I'd stay, you know? Until the end. Paolo felt a surge of emotion, sensing that there was something else weighing heavily on the old man's mind. Do you really want to stay here, Mr. Manuel? He asked gently, hesitant but needing to know. Mr. Manuel's face softened as he looked up, his eyes filled with an aching vulnerability. He took a deep breath, as if to steady himself. No, Paolo. If I'm honest, I'd give anything to be back there. Even if it's just for one more day. Paolo's heart clenched at the words. An idea began to take shape in his mind. An idea that was both reckless and deeply compelling. He didn't want to see Mr. Manuel's life end in resignation, without one last taste of the life he'd built with his own hands. After a long moment, Paolo leaned forward, his voice steady. What if we went back, Mr. Manuel? Just for a visit? Mr. Manuel's head snapped up, his eyes widening with a mixture of shock and hope. Back to my home? Paolo nodded, a determined smile spreading across his face. Why not? Just for today. You deserve to see it again, don't you think? Mr. Manuel's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he struggled to process the words. Paolo, that's the kindest thing anyone has offered me in years, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Are you sure? Of course, Paolo replied firmly, his decision made. We'll go today. Let's give you a chance to see your home again. With Paolo's help, Mr. Manuel slowly rose from his chair, his excitement giving him an energy Paolo hadn't seen before. He gathered his notebook with trembling hands, clutching it like a lifeline as they made their way out of the nursing home. The journey back to Mr. Manuel's home was quiet, filled with the hum of anticipation. Paolo drove slowly, letting Mr. Manuel take in the familiar streets, each corner bringing them closer to the place he had missed so deeply. And as they turned onto the narrow lane that led to his house, Mr. Manuel's face lit up with a look of pure, unfiltered joy. There it is, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. My home. Paolo parked the car, his own heart pounding with a mixture of exhilaration and relief. Take your time, Mr. Manuel, he said softly. This is your moment. Mr. Manuel stepped out of the taxi, his eyes scanning every inch of the little house, as if he were rediscovering an old friend. The walls were weathered, the paint faded, but to him, it was more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. He moved slowly, his hand trailing along the familiar stones of the walkway, his fingers brushing against the worn wood of the front door. And as he stood there, on the threshold of the home he had built with love and care, a single tear traced its way down his cheek. Paolo stayed back, giving him space, watching as Mr. Manuel allowed himself to relive memories that had long been tucked away. For the first time in years, Mr. Manuel felt truly at peace. And standing beside him, Paolo knew that this single act of kindness had given the old man something he would never forget. As Mr. Manuel took in every detail of his home, it was as if he were stepping back in time. He moved through the small, weathered house with reverence, brushing his fingers over the walls, touching the doorframes, pausing to savor the faint smell of old wood and memories. Paolo trailed behind, careful to let Mr. Manuel experience each moment without intrusion. After a while, they found themselves in the cozy living room, where an armchair, worn but beloved, sat in a patch of sunlight streaming in through the window. Mr. Manuel looked at it for a long moment, then sank slowly into it, his hand resting on the armrest as if it were an old friend. Paolo took a seat across from him, sensing that Mr. Manuel needed a moment to settle into the feeling of being home. He watched as the elderly man closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lips, as though he could almost feel Maria's presence beside him. The air was thick with emotion, a quiet reverence for the years of love and life lived in these rooms. After a few moments of silence, Mr. Manuel opened his eyes, his gaze drifting around the room, lingering on each photo and memento that told the story of his life. There was a wedding photo on a small table by the armchair, the faces of a young Mr. Manuel and Maria beaming with joy, surrounded by friends and family. Mr. Manuel picked it up, his fingers tracing the edges of the frame. "Maria and I built this place together, every piece of it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "We didn't have much, but we built a life here. She was my anchor, my everything. After she passed, I tried to keep going, to live out our dreams, even if I was doing it alone. But it's not easy growing old alone, Paolo." His voice faltered, a hint of sadness slipping through. Paolo swallowed, unsure of how to respond, but he knew he needed to say something. "I can't imagine how hard it must have been, Mr. Manuel. You must have loved her a lot." Mr. Manuel nodded, his face softening with the memory. "Yes, and when you love someone that deeply, they stay with you. Every day, she's there in the small things, the way the light falls in the morning, the flowers we planted together, the sound of her favorite song." He looked down, his hands trembling slightly. "But still, it's hard to be alone, especially when there's no one left to share the memories with." Paolo felt a wave of sadness for this man who had given so much, who had loved so deeply, and who now faced his final years alone. He wanted to offer some comfort, some hope, but before he could speak, Mr. Manuel took a deep breath, his gaze steadying. "I never thought I'd end up in a nursing home, Paolo," he said, his voice a faint whisper. "I always pictured myself spending my last days here, in the house we built. It feels like I'm abandoning her by leaving this place behind." Paolo's chest tightened at Mr. Manuel's words. He realized that for Mr. Manuel, leaving this home was more than just a change in address. It felt like leaving a piece of himself behind. He didn't know what to say, but he couldn't bear to see Mr. Manuel in such anguish. "Maybe," Paolo hesitated, unsure if he should say what he was thinking, but he pushed forward. "Maybe this doesn't have to be the end, Mr. Manuel. Maybe you can keep coming back here. I'd be happy to bring you, as often as you'd like." Mr. Manuel's eyes filled with a flicker of hope, and for a moment, he looked like a younger man, one with a purpose and a place to belong. "Would you really do that, Paolo?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief and gratitude. "Of course," Paolo replied, his tone firm. "We could make it a regular thing. You don't have to say goodbye to this place." Mr. Manuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a look of deep relief spreading across his face. He reached across the small table and clasped Paolo's hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone his age. "Thank you, Paolo. You don't know what this means to me." They sat in silence for a while, a peaceful quiet filling the room. Paolo looked around, taking in the photographs on the walls, the simple decorations, the little touches of personality that made the house feel like a home. He realized then how much Mr. Manuel had built here. Not just a house, but a life full of memories, love, and dreams. Finally, Mr. Manuel broke the silence, his gaze far away as he spoke. "You know, Paolo, I've lived a full life, but there's one thing I regret." He paused, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I wish I'd had more time to pass on what I've learned. So many stories, so many lessons, and now, it feels like they'll all disappear with me." Paolo shook his head. "No, Mr. Manuel, that won't happen. I'd love to hear them, all of them. You've got a lifetime of stories, and it would be an honor to listen." Mr. Manuel's face softened, his eyes brightening. "You're a good man, Paolo. I haven't known you long, but I can see it. You're giving me something I thought I'd lost, the chance to be heard." Paolo smiled, feeling an unexpected sense of purpose settle over him. Then let's keep telling those stories, Mr. Manuel. Every time we come back here, you can share one, and I'll make sure it lives on. With a final look around the room, Mr. Manuel nodded, his expression one of quiet contentment. He settled back into his chair, his hands resting on his notebook, as though he were finally at peace. They spent the next few hours there, Mr. Manuel sharing stories of his youth, his adventures with Maria, the life they had built together, and the dreams they had pursued. When the afternoon sun began to dip, casting a golden glow across the room, Paulo gently suggested they return to the nursing home. Mr. Manuel nodded, his gaze lingering on the room one last time before he slowly rose from his chair. As they stepped outside and closed the door, Paulo noticed a change in Mr. Manuel's expression. He seemed lighter, more at ease, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Paulo realized then that this visit had been more than just a trip down memory lane. It had been a chance for Mr. Manuel to reconnect with his past, to find peace with his memories. On the drive back to the nursing home, Mr. Manuel turned to Paulo, his face filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Paulo. I didn't think I'd ever feel this at peace again. You've given me a gift today, more than you could know." Paulo's heart swelled with emotion. "It's been a gift for me too, Mr. Manuel. You've taught me more in a day than I could ever learn on my own." They rode in comfortable silence, each lost in their thoughts, until they finally arrived at the nursing home. Paulo helped Mr. Manuel inside, and as they parted ways, Mr. Manuel placed a hand on Paulo's shoulder, his eyes filled with appreciation. "Thank you, Paulo," he said once more, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost. And that's a rare gift." Paulo nodded, unable to find the words, and watched as Mr. Manuel made his way inside. As he returned to his taxi and drove off, he felt a profound sense of purpose, knowing that he had been part of something meaningful, something that would stay with him forever. And as the sun began to set, Paulo found himself wondering what other memories lay within Mr. Manuel's notebook, and what stories they might uncover together in the days to come. Days passed, and Paulo found his thoughts drifting back to Mr. Manuel more often than he'd expected. The old man's stories, his love for his home, and the look of peace that had crossed his face when they'd visited lingered in Paulo's mind like an unresolved song. It felt strange, almost unsettling, how deeply their brief time together had affected him. Paulo had made good on his promise, visiting Mr. Manuel regularly at the nursing home. Each time he came, he noticed a spark in the old man's eyes, a glimmer of excitement and purpose that hadn't been there before. With every visit, Mr. Manuel would take out his notebook and share another piece of his life. Paulo had learned about Mr. Manuel's years working as a carpenter, the times he and Maria had explored the countryside, the small victories and heartbreaks that made up a life well lived. One evening, as Paulo sat across from Mr. Manuel in the nursing home's garden, he saw a shadow of sadness flicker across the old man's face. Mr. Manuel turned his gaze to the trees, his voice quiet, as though he were speaking more to himself than to Paulo. "You know, Paulo, I sometimes wonder if I did enough. If I left anything behind worth remembering. When Maria passed, she took the best of me with her. And now here I am, at the end of my journey, with nothing but memories." Paulo felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same one he'd felt on that first day. He took a deep breath, his heart racing with the urge to help, though he wasn't yet sure how. "But those memories, they're important, Mr. Manuel. They're everything. You built a life, a home, a legacy. That's worth remembering." Mr. Manuel offered a small, grateful smile, but Paulo could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. "Maybe," he murmured. "But memories fade, don't they? They're like sand slipping through our fingers." That night, as Paulo drove home, Mr. Manuel's words echoed in his mind, pulling at him in a way he couldn't ignore. Mr. Manuel wasn't just a passenger. He was someone who had shared his soul, who had let Paulo glimpse into the depth of his life. Paulo knew he couldn't let that end in a place where Mr. Manuel felt disconnected and alone. As he lay in bed that night, Paulo stared at the ceiling, grappling with the weight of his feelings. He kept thinking of Mr. Manuel's longing for his home, for the life he had built with Maria. It felt unfair, cruel even, that he had to leave it all behind. Paolo felt an idea stirring, reckless, and just a little crazy. He knew it would change things, that it could complicate his life, but the thought of doing nothing felt worse. The next day, Paolo called his friend Leo, a close confidant who had worked with him during his early years as a cab driver. Leo picked up on the second ring. "Hey Paolo. Long time, man. What's going on?" Paolo hesitated, unsure how to explain. "Hey Leo. I know this might sound strange, but I've got a situation. There's a man, a passenger actually from a few days back. I've been visiting him in a nursing home. He shared a lot with me, things that have really stuck." Leo laughed. "Man, I know you're all about connecting with your fares, but I didn't think you'd get this deep. What's going on with him?" Paolo took a deep breath. "He doesn't want to be there, Leo. He has a home, one he built with his own hands with his wife. He's got no family, no one to stand up for him. I keep thinking, maybe he doesn't have to stay there." There was a pause on the other end, and then Leo's tone turned serious. "So, what are you thinking? You're not going to break him out or something, are you?" Paolo laughed, though he felt a thrill at the suggestion. "Not exactly. I want to know if he has any other options. If he could stay in his home instead, maybe with some help. He deserves that, doesn't he?" Leo was quiet for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Look, I think you're right to feel that way, Paolo. But you have to think about what this would mean. The guy's got no family. Who's going to make sure he's okay? And you know the system. It's not easy to just take someone out of a facility. It could be a long process." Paolo nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. "I know it won't be easy, but I think it's worth it. Maybe he could get a nurse, or someone to check in on him regularly. I can't stand the thought of him ending his days in a place that doesn't feel like home." Leo let out a sigh. "You're one of a kind, Paolo. Look, if you're serious about this, I'll help however I can. I know a few people who might have advice on how to navigate the system. And hey, whatever happens, Mr. Manuel's lucky to have you in his corner." As Paolo hung up, a spark of hope flared within him. This was just the beginning, but he felt ready, even eager, to face the challenges ahead. The next time he visited Mr. Manuel, Paolo broached the subject carefully. "Mr. Manuel," he began, "if there was a way for you to stay in your home, with some help to check in on you, would you want that?" The old man looked up, his expression one of shock and hope. "My home," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Paolo, that would be a dream. But is it even possible?" Paolo nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility he was about to undertake. "I don't know yet, but I'll find out. You deserve that chance, Mr. Manuel. And I'll do everything I can to make it happen." A tear slipped down Mr. Manuel's cheek as he reached out, taking Paolo's hand with a grip that was both strong and frail. "Thank you, Paolo. I thought I'd made peace with things, but maybe I was just giving up." Paolo squeezed his hand. "You're not giving up, Mr. Manuel. You're fighting for your life, for what's yours. And I'll be here every step of the way." Over the following weeks, Paolo dedicated every spare moment to researching options, reaching out to contacts, and navigating the labyrinth of rules and regulations surrounding elder care. He knew it would be a long road, but he was willing to put in the work. With each step forward, he felt closer to fulfilling his promise to Mr. Manuel. Finally, after a grueling amount of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings, Paolo found a solution. Mr. Manuel could return to his home, but he would need a visiting nurse and some modifications to ensure his safety. Paolo felt a surge of relief as he shared the news with Mr. Manuel, who listened with shining eyes, his hands trembling as he processed the words. "So, I can go home," he whispered, his voice filled with a wonder Paolo hadn't heard before. "Yes," Paolo replied, grinning with excitement. "You'll need a little help, but you'll be in your own space, with your memories and the life you built. You'll be home, Mr. Manuel." In the days that followed, Paolo helped Mr. Manuel pack up his few belongings and arranged for the necessary adjustments to his house. Finally, the day came when Paolo helped him step through his own front door once more, his eyes filling with tears as he breathed in the familiar scent of his home. They spent the afternoon together, settling him back into his beloved armchair, surrounded by the warmth of his past. Mr. Manuel held Paolo's hand in gratitude, his face radiant with peace. "Thank you, Paolo," he said softly, his voice steady and sure. "Because of you, I've got my life back." Paolo smiled, feeling a satisfaction that ran deeper than anything he'd ever known. He had done more than just help a stranger. He had given Mr. Manuel a new beginning, a final chapter filled with dignity and love. As the sun set outside the window, casting a warm glow across the room, Paolo knew he would always remember this moment. And though he couldn't know what the future held, he felt certain that he and Mr. Manuel would face it together. Two unlikely friends, bound by the simple, extraordinary power of kindness. Paolo quickly settled into a routine with Mr. Manuel, visiting him every few days to help with errands, groceries, and to simply keep him company. The house had been modified to ensure Mr. Manuel's safety, with railings installed along the hallway, a new shower seat in the bathroom, and a few other adjustments to make daily life easier. A nurse came by twice a week, but most days it was Paolo who made sure the old man had everything he needed. Mr. Manuel seemed to thrive in his own home. His health improved, and with every visit, Paolo noticed a sparkle in the old man's eyes. They'd spend hours talking, laughing, and even watching old movies that Mr. Manuel had collected over the years. Sometimes, when Paolo would arrive, Mr. Manuel would be waiting with his notebook open, ready to share a new story from his life with Maria. One warm afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, Paolo noticed Mr. Manuel staring out the window, his gaze distant. "What's on your mind, Mr. Manuel?" Paolo asked, already sensing there was something weighing on him. Mr. Manuel sighed, his eyes still fixed on the window. "It's funny, being back here has brought me so much peace. But it's also brought something else, an emptiness almost." He turned to Paolo, his expression pensive. "I always thought coming back here would be enough. But now, I realize that it isn't just this place I miss, it's Maria, and all the things we dreamed of doing. I thought I could let it go, but it's harder than I thought." Paolo shifted uncomfortably, not knowing what to say. He could see how much Mr. Manuel still longed for his wife, for the life they had dreamed of living together. Maybe there's a way to still honor those dreams, Mr. Manuel," he suggested, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe there's something we can do to bring you closer to that life." Mr. Manuel shook his head slowly, a faint smile on his lips. "It's too late for me, Paolo. I don't have the strength to go on adventures or travel to far-off places. I missed that chance when I was younger." Paolo sat quietly for a moment, then leaned forward, his eyes bright with determination. "What if we started small?" he said, an idea forming in his mind. "What if we did something you and Maria always wanted to do, right here in your own home?" Mr. Manuel looked at him, a spark of interest igniting in his gaze. "Like what?" Paolo thought for a moment, then his face lit up. "What about a garden? You told me you and Maria used to talk about having a garden, a place where you could grow flowers and sit in the sun together. We could start one here, in the backyard." Mr. Manuel's eyes widened, and a slow smile spread across his face. "A garden?" he murmured, his voice filled with wonder. "Yes, that's something Maria and I always wanted. She used to love flowers, lilies, roses, wildflowers. She said a garden was like a piece of heaven on earth." Paolo grinned, already envisioning the project. "Then let's do it, Mr. Manuel. We'll plant a garden together, one that would make Maria proud. It doesn't have to be big, just a few flowers, maybe some herbs, whatever you like. We'll make it a place where you can remember her." A tear slipped down Mr. Manuel's cheek as he nodded, his expression one of deep gratitude. "I'd like that, Paolo. I think she would too." Over the next few days, Paolo and Mr. Manuel planned the garden, selecting flowers and herbs that held meaning for Mr. Manuel. Roses because they had been Maria's favorite. Lavender, for its calming scent. Basil and rosemary, because Maria had loved to cook with them. With each plant they chose, Mr. Manuel seemed to come alive, sharing memories of his wife and the dreams they had shared. When everything was ready, Paolo brought over pots, soil, and seedlings, and they got to work. Mr. Manuel watched, sometimes lending a hand, as Paolo dug into the earth and arranged the plants carefully. They spent hours in the backyard, talking and laughing, and Mr. Manuel even hummed an old tune now and then, his voice soft and filled with nostalgia. As the garden took shape, Paolo noticed a light in Mr. Manuel's eyes that he hadn't seen before. It was as if, through each flower they planted, he was reconnecting with a part of himself he had thought was lost. One evening, after a long day of work, they stood together, admiring the small but beautiful garden they had created. The flowers glistened in the golden light of sunset, and a gentle breeze carried their fragrance through the air. "It's perfect," Mr. Manuel murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "Maria would have loved this. It's like she's here with us, isn't it?" Paolo nodded, his own heart swelling with pride and happiness. "I think she's been here all along, Mr. Manuel. She's in every flower, every memory you've shared. This garden, it's your way of keeping her close." Mr. Manuel placed a trembling hand on Paolo's shoulder, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Paolo, I can never repay you for what you've done. You've given me more than just a garden. You've given me a piece of my heart back." They sat together in the garden as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the flowers. Mr. Manuel began to talk, his voice soft and full of warmth, sharing stories of Maria, of the times they had spent together, of the love they had built. Paolo listened, captivated, feeling as though he were part of something greater than himself, a witness to a love that had transcended time and distance. In the days that followed, Mr. Manuel spent hours in the garden, tending to the flowers and herbs, watering them carefully, speaking to them as though Maria could hear every word. The garden became his sanctuary, a place where he could feel close to his wife, where he could find peace in the simple act of nurturing life. Paolo continued to visit, helping Mr. Manuel with the garden, bringing him books, music, and anything else he thought might brighten his days. But despite the joy that the garden had brought him, Paolo noticed a restlessness in Mr. Manuel, a sense of longing that hadn't quite faded. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Mr. Manuel turned to Paolo, his face thoughtful. "There's something else, Paolo. Something I need to do." Paolo raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it, Mr. Manuel?" Mr. Manuel took a deep breath, his gaze distant. "I need to go back. There's a place, a little town by the coast where Maria and I spent our honeymoon. She always talked about going back there, seeing the ocean, hearing the waves. We never got the chance." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like to go there, just once more before it's too late." Paolo felt a surge of determination. He knew what he had to do. "Then let's go, Mr. Manuel. Let's go to the coast." The old man looked at him surprised. You would do that? But it's so far. And I'm not as strong as I used to be." Paolo smiled, his eyes filled with resolve. "We'll take it slow. I'll be right there with you. You've done so much, Mr. Manuel. You deserve this." For a long moment, Mr. Manuel stared at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Thank you, Paolo. I didn't think I'd ever get to see that place again." As they made plans for the journey, Paolo felt a deep sense of purpose. This trip wouldn't be easy, but he knew it was the right thing to do. It was a chance for Mr. Manuel to revisit the dreams he'd once shared with Maria, to find closure in a place that had meant so much to them. And in the quiet of the garden, under the gentle sway of the flowers they had planted together, Paolo promised himself that he would see this journey through. Mr. Manuel's story wasn't over yet, and Paolo would do whatever it took to help him complete it. The day finally arrived for Paolo and Mr. Manuel to begin their journey to the coast, to the small town where he and Maria had spent their honeymoon so many years ago. Paolo had taken care of all the details, ensuring Mr. Manuel's comfort and safety along the way. They would drive, taking breaks at quiet spots for meals and rest, letting Mr. Manuel savor the world outside his home one last time. As they set off, Mr. Manuel settled into the passenger seat, his face glowing with a quiet anticipation. The road stretched out before them, winding through hills and towns, each mile bringing them closer to the sea. They drove in companionable silence for a while, and then Mr. Manuel turned to Paolo, a faint smile on his lips. "This reminds me of all the times Maria and I would take little road trips," he said. "We didn't have much, but we had each other. That was enough." Paolo glanced over, feeling a sense of awe for the life Mr. Manuel had lived. "I think she'd be happy you're doing this, Mr. Manuel. I think she'd be proud." Mr. Manuel nodded, a faraway look in his eyes. I like to think she's with us now, watching over us, just as she always did. They continued on, stopping in small villages along the way, where Paulo and Mr. Manuel would wander through markets and small shops, admiring handmade crafts and sampling fresh-baked pastries. Mr. Manuel seemed energized by the journey, his spirit lifted by the change of scenery and the new experiences. Every time they stopped, he'd tell Paulo another story, sharing memories of Maria and the adventures they'd once shared. As the hours passed and they drew closer to the coast, Mr. Manuel grew quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Paulo knew he was feeling the weight of the past, the memories of the life he'd built with Maria. And he let him have his silence, sensing that words would only intrude. Finally, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the landscape, they arrived at the small coastal town. It was quaint and unassuming, with narrow streets lined with pastel-colored houses and a winding path that led down to the shore. The distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks filled the air, mingling with the soft calls of seagulls flying overhead. Paulo parked the car, and for a moment, they both sat in silence, absorbing the beauty of the place. Mr. Manuel's eyes filled with tears as he looked out over the town, 1,000 memories reflected in his gaze. "It's just as I remember it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The sound of the sea, the smell of salt in the air. It's like stepping back in time." Paulo reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Take your time, Mr. Manuel. This is your moment." They made their way down to the shore, where the sand stretched out before them in soft, golden waves. Mr. Manuel walked slowly, his feet sinking slightly into the sand with each step, his eyes drinking in every detail of the scene before him. Paulo walked beside him, letting him set the pace, understanding that this wasn't just a place. It was a memory made real, a bridge to the life he had shared with Maria. As they reached the water's edge, Mr. Manuel paused, bending down to pick up a smooth stone. He held it in his hand, his fingers tracing its contours as though it were a treasured keepsake. "Maria loved to collect stones from every beach we visited," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She said they were little pieces of eternity, worn smooth by time and the sea." Paulo watched as Mr. Manuel looked out over the waves, his face a mixture of peace and longing. "Would you like to sit here for a while?" he asked gently. Mr. Manuel nodded, and they found a spot on a nearby rock, watching as the sun sank lower, casting a fiery glow over the water. The waves lapped gently at the shore, a soothing rhythm that seemed to carry away the weight of the years. After a while, Mr. Manuel turned to Paulo, his expression contemplative. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you," he said, his voice steady. "I thought that, when Maria left, I'd lost my chance to live the way we had dreamed. But you've shown me that even now, life can surprise you, can still be full of beauty." Paulo felt a surge of emotion, realizing that this journey meant more than he'd understood. It was more than a return to a beloved place. It was a reminder that love and memories could carry on, even as time moved forward. "You've lived a beautiful life, Mr. Manuel," he said softly. "And I think Maria would be so proud of the man you are." Mr. Manuel smiled, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you, Paulo, for everything. You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again." They sat together in silence, the waves stretching out before them like a blanket of stars under the evening sky. The air grew cool, and Paulo wrapped a blanket around Mr. Manuel's shoulders, knowing that the night would soon settle in. But they remained there, watching as the last light of day faded into darkness, the stars appearing one by one over the water. When they finally stood to leave, Mr. Manuel lingered a moment longer, his gaze sweeping over the beach, the sea, the sky. "Goodbye, Maria," he murmured, his voice carrying a quiet, heartfelt farewell. "Thank you for everything." As they turned to walk back to the car, Paulo felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had given Mr. Manuel a chance to return to a place he loved, to find closure in a way he had never thought possible. And in that moment he realized that Mr. Manuel's journey wasn't just about revisiting the past. It was about embracing the present, honoring the life he had lived, and finding joy in every remaining moment. On the drive back, Mr. Manuel slept peacefully, a gentle smile on his face as he rested. Paolo glanced over, feeling a warmth spread through him, a satisfaction that went beyond words. This journey had been more than he had expected, a testament to the power of kindness, of friendship, of honoring the past while moving forward. As they returned to the little town, Paolo looked out over the darkened landscape, feeling that he too had been changed by this journey. He knew that he and Mr. Manuel would always share this memory, a moment of peace and beauty that would carry them both forward. And as they approached Mr. Manuel's home, Paolo felt a quiet sense of purpose settling over him. This journey had been a gift, a way to honor a life filled with love and memories. And he knew that whatever the future held, he would carry this experience with him, a reminder of the extraordinary impact one person could have on another's life. The morning after their return, Paolo visited Mr. Manuel's home, half expecting the old man to be resting after their journey. To his surprise, he found Mr. Manuel sitting in the garden they had created together, a serene look on his face as he gazed at the flowers they had planted. A gentle breeze rustled the petals, carrying their sweet fragrance through the air, and Paolo could see that Mr. Manuel was lost in thought, perhaps still by the sea in his mind. "Mr. Manuel," Paolo called softly as he approached. The old man turned, his eyes lighting up at the sight of his friend. "Paolo, come sit with me," Mr. Manuel said, patting the chair beside him. "I was just thinking about our trip, and about Maria." Paolo sat down, smiling as he looked over the garden. "It was a beautiful journey, Mr. Manuel. I feel lucky to have been part of it." Mr. Manuel nodded, a distant look in his eyes. "You know, Paolo, there were so many moments that I thought I'd never get back. But being there by the ocean, it was as if I could feel Maria's presence beside me, as real as the waves themselves. I thought that returning to a place like that would make me feel her absence even more. But instead, I felt complete." Paolo felt his heart swell at Mr. Manuel's words, sensing the peace that had settled over his friend. "Maybe that's because she's never really left you," he offered. "Every memory, every story you've shared, she's been with you all along." Mr. Manuel smiled softly, his eyes misting with gratitude. "Thank you, Paolo. You've given me something I thought was lost forever. A way to live these memories again, to feel the joy and love of those moments as if they're new." They sat in comfortable silence, the garden alive with the colors and fragrances of the flowers they had planted. After a while, Mr. Manuel reached for his notebook, holding it gently in his lap as he looked at Paolo, a twinkle in his eye. "There's something I've been meaning to share with you," he said, opening the notebook to a particular page. "I kept this all these years, and now I think it's time for you to know it." Paolo leaned forward, intrigued as Mr. Manuel turned the pages with careful, reverent fingers. His hands rested on a faded photograph, one of Maria and himself in their younger days, standing by a small, unfinished house. "This," Mr. Manuel said, pointing to the photo, "was the day we laid the first bricks of our home. It was our dream, our life together." He chuckled, his eyes sparkling with fondness. "We had nothing but our hands and a lot of hope. We built it one stone at a time." Paolo felt a warmth spread through him as he looked at the image, struck by the joy on their faces, the sense of possibility that radiated from the two young lovers standing proudly before their unfinished home. "Looking at this," Mr. Manuel continued, "I realized that every moment of love we built here is still alive. And it's because of you, Paolo. You gave me the chance to remember that, to feel it again." Paolo swallowed, moved by the depth of Mr. Manuel's words. He felt an overwhelming respect for the man beside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. "It's been an honor, Mr. Manuel. I didn't know when I met you that we'd come this far. But I'm so glad we did." Mr. Manuel reached over, placing a hand on Paolo's shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "Paolo, you're like a son to me. I don't say that lightly. In these months, you've given me companionship, a way to relive my memories. I only wish I had more time to see what life might bring for you." Paolo felt a pang of emotion, humbled by Mr. Manuel's words. "You'll be here a long time, Mr. Manuel," he said with a soft smile. "We still have so many stories to share." The days that followed were filled with peace and joy, each one adding to the tapestry of Mr. Manuel's life. They worked together in the garden, read books under the shade of the trees, and every now and then, made small trips around the town, visiting old cafes and the local library, places that held little memories for Mr. Manuel. One afternoon, Mr. Manuel mentioned he wanted to visit a local community center where he and Maria used to volunteer. He had donated books there over the years and wanted to see the collection again. Paulo eagerly agreed, knowing how much the center meant to Mr. Manuel. As they entered the cozy building, a few volunteers greeted Mr. Manuel warmly, recognizing him from years past. He introduced Paulo, a smile of pride on his face, as he explained how Paulo had become a true friend and companion. They wandered through the book collection, and Mr. Manuel beamed as he ran his fingers over the spines, some worn with age. He pulled a few from the shelves, showing Paulo inscriptions he and Maria had written, small dedications to each other and to future readers. As they left, Mr. Manuel turned to Paulo, his face a mixture of gratitude and nostalgia. "I feel like I'm saying goodbye to every piece of my life, Paulo. And yet I don't feel sad, because I know that these memories will live on, through you and through the lives we touched." Paulo felt his throat tighten, sensing a finality in Mr. Manuel's words. He tried to smile, but a part of him felt a growing ache, a reluctance to let go of this friendship that had come to mean so much to him. That night, as Paulo helped Mr. Manuel settle in, the old man clasped his hand, his eyes full of warmth. "You've brought me peace, Paulo. You've helped me find a way to say goodbye." Paulo nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me more than I could ever repay, Mr. Manuel. You've shown me what it means to live a life full of love and purpose." With a gentle smile, Mr. Manuel patted his hand. "Then, my friend, it's been a good journey for us both." As Paulo left that night, he felt a sense of completion, a quiet understanding that this chapter was drawing to a close. He knew that Mr. Manuel's journey was nearing its end, but he also knew that every moment they had shared would stay with him, a part of his own story. In the weeks that followed, Paulo continued to visit Mr. Manuel, sensing the peace that had settled over his friend, a tranquility that came from knowing he had lived a life rich with love and memories. They shared laughter and stories, reliving each cherished moment with gratitude and joy. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the flowers in the garden closed for the night, Paulo received a call from the nurse, who checked in on Mr. Manuel. Her voice was gentle, respectful. "Mr. Manuel passed peacefully in his sleep this evening," she said. "He was at peace, Paulo. I wanted you to know that he left this world with a smile." Paulo felt tears fill his eyes, but there was no bitterness, no sadness. He knew that Mr. Manuel had left with a heart full of love, with every memory honored and cherished. And as he sat there, remembering his friend, he felt a deep, unshakable gratitude for the journey they had shared. In the days that followed, Paulo found himself revisiting the places he and Mr. Manuel had explored together. The cafe where they had laughed over coffee, the library where they had searched for books, the garden where they had planted flowers in honor of Maria. Each place held a piece of Mr. Manuel, a reminder of the love and memories he had left behind. On a quiet morning, Paulo returned to Mr. Manuel's home, now empty, but still vibrant with the spirit of the man who had lived there. He stepped into the garden, gazing at the flowers that had bloomed beautifully, a testament to the life and love Mr. Manuel had shared. With a quiet smile, Paulo whispered, "Goodbye, Mr. Manuel. Thank you for everything." And as he left, he felt the weight of Mr. Manuel's stories, his kindness, his resilience settle into his heart, a part of him forever. He knew he would carry those memories forward, sharing them with others, honoring the life of the man who had shown him the true meaning of love, friendship, and the legacy of a life well lived. Mr. Manuel's story would live on, as Paulo had promised, each memory a piece of the journey they had taken together. And with every new step he took, Paulo knew that a part of his friend would walk with him, a silent guide, reminding him to live with love, to cherish every moment, and to honor the beautiful memories that made a life. In the weeks after Mr. Manuel's passing, Paulo found himself returning to the places they had visited together, seeking a sense of closeness with his friend. Each location held a memory, a story Mr. Manuel had shared, and Paulo felt these memories wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. But as much as he cherished these moments, he knew that he wanted to do something more, something that would carry forward Mr. Manuel's legacy in a way that others could feel and benefit from. One morning, as he sat in Mr. Manuel's now empty garden, he looked around at the flowers they had planted together, each bloom a reminder of Maria's memory, of Mr. Manuel's resilience, and of the bond they had formed. Paulo's mind started to race with possibilities. What if he could bring Mr. Manuel's story to life in a way that would touch others? What if he could share the kindness and wisdom he had learned from his friend? Paulo knew exactly what he wanted to do. Over the next few days, Paulo spent his spare time visiting the local community center, the same one where Mr. Manuel had once volunteered and donated books. The center had a small library, with shelves that Mr. Manuel himself had built years ago. It was here that Paulo felt closest to him, and he wanted to honor that connection by sharing what he had learned from Mr. Manuel. He spoke with the center's director, a kind woman named Ana, who listened with interest as Paulo described Mr. Manuel's life, his stories, and the impact he had made. Ana was moved, and after a few moments of thought, she suggested something that filled Paulo with excitement. "What if we create a program in his memory?" she said. "A community initiative, a place where people can come to share their stories, just as Mr. Manuel shared his with you." Paulo's heart swelled at the idea. A storytelling circle, a place for people to gather, to listen and to be heard, he murmured. Mr. Manuel would have loved that. Together, Paulo and Ana began organizing the first meeting of Manuel's Circle, a gathering where people could come to share their stories, to find companionship, and to feel that their memories mattered. They printed flyers, spread the word throughout the community, and set a date for the first gathering, hopeful that others would be drawn to the idea. The day finally arrived, and Paulo felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation as he arrived at the center. Ana greeted him warmly, guiding him to the room where the chairs had been arranged in a circle, the atmosphere warm and inviting. A few people had already arrived, each holding a small object or photo, something meaningful they wanted to share. Paulo couldn't help but feel that Mr. Manuel was watching over them, a quiet presence in the room, smiling at the way his legacy had blossomed. As more people filled the room, Paulo began the meeting by sharing the story of Mr. Manuel. He spoke of their first drive together, of the garden they had planted, and of the final journey they had taken to the coast. Each word was filled with love and gratitude, and he could see the impact of Mr. Manuel's life reflected in the eyes of those around him. When he finished, a silence settled over the room, a shared reverence for the life they had just heard about. Then, one by one, the others began to share their own stories. Memories of loved ones, small acts of kindness that had shaped their lives, dreams that had been fulfilled or left behind. Each story was a tribute, not only to the people in the room, but to Mr. Manuel, who had inspired them all to come together. Over time, Manuel's circle grew, drawing in people from all walks of life, young and old, each with a story to tell. The circle became a place of healing, a space where people could honor the past while finding hope for the future. Paulo was there for every meeting, listening, encouraging, and sharing in the laughter and tears that filled the room. One evening, after a particularly moving session, Ana approached Paulo, a gentle smile on her face. "You know, this wouldn't have been possible without you. You've given this community something beautiful, something lasting." Paulo shook his head, his heart swelling with humility. "It wasn't me, Ana. It was Mr. Manuel. I was just lucky enough to know him." Ana nodded, her eyes reflecting the warmth of understanding. "Maybe so, but you carried his memory forward. You took his stories, his kindness, and shared them with others. That's a gift." As Paulo left the center that night, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a knowledge that Mr. Manuel's story would live on through every person who came to the circle. His friend's life had become a beacon, a guiding light that reminded people to cherish their memories, to honor their loved ones, and to live with kindness and purpose. Months passed, and each gathering brought new faces, new stories, and new connections. The community center became a second home to Paulo, a place where he could feel Mr. Manuel's presence in every smile, every word, every moment of shared joy and sorrow. And in those gatherings, Paulo found his own purpose, a calling to help others preserve and share the beauty of their lives. On the one-year anniversary of Mr. Manuel's passing, Paulo organized a special celebration in the garden they had planted together. Friends, family, and members of the community gathered, each holding a flower, a symbol of remembrance and gratitude. They shared stories of Mr. Manuel, of the ways he had touched their lives, and of the legacy he had left behind. As the sun began to set, Paulo stood before the crowd, his voice filled with emotion as he spoke. Mr. Manuel taught me that a life well lived is not measured by wealth or success, but by the love we give and the memories we leave behind. Today we honor him, not just as a friend, but as a guide, a teacher, and a light in our lives. With tears in his eyes, Paulo placed a single rose in the garden, a final tribute to the man who had changed his life. And as he looked around at the faces of those gathered, he knew that Mr. Manuel's legacy would carry on, in every story shared, in every act of kindness, in every heart that had been touched. As they walked through the garden that evening, surrounded by flowers and memories, Paulo felt a profound peace settle over him. Mr. Manuel's journey had come full circle, his life a testament to the power of love, friendship, and the simple, enduring beauty of a story well told. And as Paulo left the garden, he carried with him the quiet, unbreakable knowledge that he would continue sharing these memories, honoring his friend's legacy, and reminding others that even the smallest moments could leave a mark on the world. In every step he took, in every life he touched, Paulo knew that Mr. Manuel's spirit walked beside him, a gentle reminder to live fully, to love deeply, and to cherish every memory. Years passed, and Manuel's circle continued to grow, becoming a beloved tradition in the community. Every month, new faces joined, drawn by word of mouth, and a growing reputation for the circle's warmth and openness. Each person came carrying their own stories, eager to share and to honor those they had loved. The gatherings became not just a celebration of memories, but a way for the community to grow closer, to bridge differences, and to find connection and shared experience. Paulo, now a bit older and a bit wiser, took on a guiding role in the circle, nurturing it just as he and Mr. Manuel had once nurtured their garden. The time he had spent with Mr. Manuel remained fresh in his mind, as if they had just shared that final journey to the coast. Every time Paulo stepped into the circle, he felt his friend's spirit with him, a quiet presence that guided him to listen with compassion and to offer comfort to those who needed it. One evening, as Paulo prepared the room for the gathering, he noticed a young woman standing by the door, her gaze hesitant. She held a worn leather journal in her hands, clutching it to her chest as if it were a lifeline. Paulo approached her with a gentle smile, recognizing the familiar look of someone who was uncertain about sharing their story. "Hi there," he said softly. "Is this your first time?" The woman nodded, her eyes a little shy. "Yes, I wasn't sure if I should come, but I found this journal. It was my grandmother's. She used to write about her life, her dreams, and I wanted to honor her. I guess I thought that sharing it here might help me feel closer to her." Paulo felt a surge of emotion as he looked at the journal, so similar to the notebook Mr. Manuel had once kept close to his heart. He could see the same love and reverence in the young woman's eyes, the same desire to preserve the memory of someone she had loved deeply. "You're in the right place," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "Everyone here has come to share something special, to honor those who have touched their lives. Your grandmother's story deserves to be heard, and we'd be honored to hear it." The woman's eyes filled with gratitude, and she took a seat, holding the journal carefully as she prepared to share her grandmother's words with the circle. Paulo couldn't help but think of Mr. Manuel, remembering how he too had clutched his notebook as if it contained his very soul. And as the woman began to read aloud, her voice soft but filled with emotion, Paulo felt a familiar warmth settle over him, as if Mr. Manuel were there, smiling in approval. After the session ended, Paulo lingered, watching as people slowly filed out, their faces glowing with the peace and connection they had found. Anna approached him, her eyes bright with affection. "It's amazing to see how this has grown, Paulo. You've built something beautiful here. I think Mr. Manuel would be so proud." Paulo looked around the room, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment and gratitude. "He taught me so much, Anna. He showed me the importance of kindness, of really listening to people's stories. Every time we gather here, It's like a piece of him lives on. Anna nodded, her face softening. You know, this circle has changed lives. People come here and leave feeling understood, heard, and loved. And that's because of you, Paolo. You're keeping his legacy alive in the most beautiful way. As they turned off the lights and prepared to lock up, Paolo looked back at the room, a smile playing on his lips. He thought about Mr. Manuel's final words to him. The gentle reminder to live fully and to honor the memories that make life meaningful. He felt a quiet pride, knowing that he had done just that he had carried forward the spirit of his friend, bringing light and connection to those who needed it. In the following days, Paolo decided to visit Mr. Manuel's old home, a place he hadn't returned to since that last night when he had said goodbye. The garden had grown lush and vibrant, the flowers blooming in a riot of colors, a beautiful testament to the life that had been lived there. Paolo knelt beside the roses, their fragrance filling the air, and closed his eyes, remembering Mr. Manuel's laughter, his wisdom, and the quiet strength that had carried him through so much. "Thank you, Mr. Manuel," he whispered, his voice filled with love, "for everything." As he stood to leave, Paolo felt a lightness in his heart, a sense of peace that told him his friend was still with him, in every story shared, in every act of kindness, in every heart touched by Manuel's circle. He knew that Mr. Manuel's legacy would continue to grow, just as the flowers in the garden would bloom each year. A reminder of a life well lived, a love that endured beyond time. And as Paolo walked away, he knew that he was not alone, that he carried with him the spirit of a true friend, a man who had shown him that life's greatest beauty lay in the simple moments, in the memories that made us who we are, and in the quiet, enduring power of kindness.